This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. You can't have The Lord of the Rings without the ring. Obviously, it's in the title. Because of the cultural impact of The Lord of the Rings, the idea of a magical ring which tempts people has become a pretty common fantasy trope, but in fact, it has always been in the storytelling tradition, from Plato all the way to 19th century opera. It's one of the most recognizable parts of The Lord of the Rings, and yet I've always struggled with people asking me the question, so what does the ring actually do? And the reason that you might hear that question a lot is because it's just not an easy one to answer. The ring seems to interact differently with every single person that it meets, and I would almost argue that it plays more of a role as a character rather than just a magical object. Today, I want to discuss the One Ring, its origins within the story and within the larger literary sphere, to try and figure out once and for all what the ring actually does and why it works so well as the linchpin of the story. The One Ring was created long ago, back in the Second Age, before Gondor was established, before the destruction of Numenor, before most of the characters that we know and love were even born. In the elvish kingdom of Eregion, Sauron disguised himself as the fair and wise Annatar, which means the Lord of Gifts. He used his smithing skills, learned from the Valar Aule, to teach the elves to craft beautiful rings imbued with magical powers. The first three rings to be created under Sauron's watchful eye were the elvish ring Narya, the Ring of Fire, Nenya, the Ring of Water, and Vilya, the Ring of Air. These rings were the epitome of elvish power, staving off the decay of time and preventing the world weariness that so often plagued elves. Together with Sauron, they made many more rings of power and so generously handed them out to the kings and leaders of the free peoples of Middle-earth. The dwarves received 7 rings, which they used to become immensely wealthy, and the men received 9, which gave them powerful sway amongst their peers and unnaturally long lives. They became kings, sorcerers, and warriors, rich with both money, influence, and fame. However, Annatar, Lord of Gifts though he is, he's not exactly giving out of the goodness of his heart. Now, the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, for the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. And while he wore the One Ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. There was only one snag in Sauron's master plan, those 3 first elven rings. Sauron had not had a direct hand in creating those, and that factor, combined with the elves that held them, some of the most shrewd and wise people in Middle-earth, meant that he had no power over those rings. While the dwarves decayed under their piles of gold, and the men were hollowed out to become wraiths, the elves refused to use their rings, and were thus untainted by the will of Sauron. So it was that Sauron's plan collapsed, and his one ring, the holder of the greatest portion of his power, was lost. But that power did not vanish. It remained, simmering and sweltering, just waiting to ensnare a new bearer. And if you would like to ensnare some folks yourself, although not for the purposes of evil, just for the purposes of establishing and building your brand, you should check out this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to allow you to stand out and succeed online. They make the process so easy with their next-generation Fluid engine, which uses drag-and-drop technology to simplify the website making process from desktop and mobile. It's just never been easier for you to unlock your creativity and create a website website that you truly love. And this is going to be the perfect place for you to display your creative work, because Squarespace allows you to organize your video library, and if you're interested, you can also put those videos behind a paywall, all through Squarespace. And it's never been easier to keep an eye on how all of this is going through their inbuilt analytics. They'll give you insight on top traffic sources, sales metrics, and feed you all the information you need to keep up engagement. If you want to give yourself a platform for your creativity or take your brand to the next level, you should check out Squarespace. Head on down to squarespace.com for a totally free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and helping to keep the lights on, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. While The Lord of the Rings is indeed an incredibly beautifully original piece of fiction, its bones were drawn from a much more ancient stew. To create his world, to inspire this new mythos, Tolkien pulled bits and pieces from everywhere across the historical and literature landscape, and that also stands true in the case of the ring. Magical rings have existed, pretty much since rings have existed. In Plato's Republic, he tells the story of the Ring of Aegis. The Ring of Aegis was a golden ring found by a young man in a cave. He took it with him because of its beauty, and soon discovered that putting it on granted him invisibility. He uses this newfound ability to conspire with the queen to kill the king and take over the kingdom, all while avoiding capture and guilt because of the invisibility granted to him by the ring. The Ring of Aegis was a philosophical device used to discuss the idea of accountability, to discuss what man might do if he knew that there were no consequences. But magical rings appear throughout medieval literature as well. In the Welsh Mabinogion, a collection of myths and folklore, there's a ring of invisibility, and in the Arthurian cycle, there's both rings of invisibility and invincibility. But some of the most iconic magical ring imagery comes later on, in the latter half of the 19th century, from German artist Richard Wagner. Across 27 years, Wagner composed a set of 4 different operas, which were collectively known as Der Ring des Nibelungen, or the Ring Cycle. The opera collectively takes over 15 hours to perform, and it's usually split off across 4 nights, and it tells the scale of epic proportions, drawing very heavily from Norse myth. The first of these operas, called Das Rheingold, tells the story of the maidens of the river Rhine, who are found by a Nibelung, a dwarf named Alberic. After they turn down his advances, Alberic gets the Rhine maidens to admit that they are guarding a treasure, gold buried in the Rhine River, that if turned into a ring will grant the wearer power over men and gods alike. Alberic is consumed by greed, and he readily seizes the treasure, renouncing love and creating his very own ring of power. Wotan, or Odin, seizes the ring from Alberic, wanting to use it to establish his own power, and so Alberic places a curse on it, that everyone who does not have the ring will want it desperately. The story plays out over the following 4 operas as the gods war against each other and humanity, and we even see the familiar story of Siegfried and the dragon Fafnir play out. The tale concludes in the 4th and final opera, called the Götterdämmerung, or the Twilight of the Gods. The frenzy of lust and greed surrounding the ring comes to a violent climax as the Valkyrie Brunhilde sacrifices herself to return the ring to the river Rhine. The gods are slain, and the opera closes on Valhalla itself in flames. Obviously, The Lord of the Rings is not a one-to-one adaptation of the Ring Cycle. In fact, Tolkien denies that it influenced him at all. But the impact that Wagner's work had on culture cannot be understated. It had an impact on Tolkien, whether it was direct or even acknowledged. There are still songs from the Ring Cycle that we all know today, such as The Ride of the Valkyries. And more importantly, Wagner created the Ring Cycle out of the same soup that Tolkien was pulling from, Germanic and Norse myths. And throughout a lot of these, magical rings are a recurring concept, but the true magic of The Lord of the Rings lies in the way that Tolkien took in these ideas, synthesized them, and created something entirely unique. Very similar to the rings of the Arthurian cycles, Tolkien's One Ring does give invincibility of a sort. It prevents aging, but as Gandalf explains to Frodo, that isn't necessarily a good thing. A mortal Frodo, who keeps one of the Great Rings, does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last every minute is a weariness. Bilbo, who's felt these effects firsthand, says, "Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right." And it's not right. One of the most beautiful and important things about Tolkien's mortal creatures is that they die. The elves, whose souls are permanently bound to Middle-earth, meaning that they cannot die, suffer immensely for that. They become weary of the world, weary of loss and pain and time, and mortals who are stretched out to immortality suffer it even further. As Tolkien describes in the Silmarillion, the men who were gifted eternal life by their rings of power come to find that life is unendurable, and it hollows them out, leaving them as nothing more than puppets for Sauron's will. From the surface, a ring that grants invisibility, it seems like fun. It's a party trick, and originally that is all it was. The Hobbit was not written to be a part of the larger world of Middle-earth, and in the original first edition, when Bilbo finds the ring, it really is just a fun little side thing. It's a tool to allow him to burgle people better. In fact, he didn't even have to fight Gollum for it. In the original first edition of the book, Gollum hands the ring over willingly as a prize for Bilbo winning the riddles contest. However, that first edition of The Hobbit was not going to be the final version of the story. Pushed for a sequel by his editors, Tolkien began pulling at some of the loose strings in The Hobbit, and he quickly realized that there might be more than meets the eye to that little golden trinket that Bilbo found in the cave. He realized that invisibility can have much darker implications. As explored by Plato's Ring of Ygis, invisibility is highly unnatural. You could do almost anything while invisible and avoid the consequences. In Plato's world, this means that inherently men will do bad things if there are no consequences, but Tolkien takes a slightly more nuanced route. Submitting to invisibility means sharing with Sauron. It means stepping into his realm. Gandalf explains, "If the ring-bearer often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes, in the end, invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later, if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last, sooner or later, the dark power will devour him." This was catastrophic to the 9 men that first held those rings. Walking invisibly meant walking with Sauron. It meant seeing his shades, his delusions, his lies, and this only served to push them further into madness. The invisibility granted by the ring, at first it kind of seems like its whole point, but when you look at it a little bit deeper, invisibility is more of just a side effect. You enter into his realm, invisible to the wider world, but all the more visible to Sauron and his cruel plans. You could argue that, just like in the ring cycle, the One Ring has a curse put on it. For all who see it do desire it. Gollum becomes completely entrapped by its seductive beauty, by the promises of power that it whispers to him. Even solid-hearted Bilbo, after years of holding onto the ring, becomes affected by its temptation. Years after he's given it up in Rivendell, he still craves it. "Well, I should just like to see it for a moment," said Bilbo. When he had dressed, Frodo found that while he slept, the ring had been hung about his neck on a new chain, light but strong. Slowly, he drew it out. Bilbo put out his hand, but Frodo quickly drew back the ring. To his distress and amazement, he found that he was no longer looking at Bilbo. A shadow seemed to have fallen between them, and through it he found himself eyeing a little wrinkled creature with a hungry face and bony, groping hands. He felt a desire to strike him. It's hard to say in this moment who is truly being affected by the ring. Did Bilbo transform into a wrinkled, wanting creature, or did Frodo, already being affected by the ring, just see him that way? It saw him as a rival, as a danger. Honestly, I think that both can be true. The ring has a distinct quality that Tom Shippey refers to as addiction. If you've never touched the ring, if you've never used it, it's not too terribly difficult to turn it down. We see characters like Galadriel and Faramir and Gandalf turn it down without even touching it. They don't want anything to do with it. But the more that you use it, the tighter of a grasp it has on you, the further it worms into your soul, twisting your entire mind to the keeping and holding of the ring. And before the journey has even begun, before Frodo has left the Shire, Gandalf can already see that it is beginning to have a pull on Frodo. Gandalf laughed grimly. "You see? Already you too, Frodo, cannot easily let it go, nor will to damage it. And I could not make you, except by force which would break your mind." By the end of the story, standing on the crack of doom, it seems all but impossible for Frodo to let go of the ring. He utterly refuses to destroy it, and it is only by the actions of another addict, of Gollum, and quite honestly, the hand of God, that the ring is able to be destroyed. So now, essentially, we know the power of the ring. It extends your life, it makes you invisible, and it is highly addictive. But all of these are kind of just incidental, and in my opinion, they circle around the true identity of the ring. It is a manifestation of pure power. It takes who you are, your natural motivations, your proclivities, your drive, and it turns it up to 11. It allows you to see more, to know more, to become more than you ever thought was possible. It transforms you into someone who wants to be as tyrannically, possessively controlling as Sauron himself. On Mount Doom, Sam witnesses this in a very literal way as he watches the confrontation between Frodo and Gollum. Sam saw these two rivals with other vision. A crouching shape, scarcely more than the shadow of a living thing. A creature now wholly ruined and defeated, yet filled with a hideous lust and rage. And before it stood stern, untouchable now by pity, a figure robed in white, but at its breast it held a wheel of fire. Gollum is one end of the spectrum of what the ring can do to you. He is hollowed out, he is left with nothing, torn apart by the constant battle with himself. But Frodo, who has the ring, he's in his prime. And yet, just as much as Gollum, he has become inhuman. And this is all in pursuit of control. Sauron's end goal is not destruction. He doesn't just want to see the world burn around him. His goal is complete domination. And if he has to raise creation to the ground in order to make that happen, he's willing to do that. But the ring reveals that in order to have that kind of power, to have that kind of control and domination, you have to give something up. You have to become inhuman. So it is that by pursuing everything, you end up with nothing. And the ring is a perfect manifestation of that fact. In an attempt to enslave other beings, especially the elves, Sauron placed a large part of his inherent strength outside of himself in this object. The ring adds to his power, but also dominates him. He must wield it to retain power, but will lose all his strength if it falls into the possession of anyone strong enough to wield it against him. Thus, using the ring must entail a constant anxiety about potential rivals. Sauron's strength is no longer his own. That is the paradox of power, as identified by Tolkien. By creating a weapon that could claim the world, Sauron created the one weapon that could defeat him. We see him realize this when Frodo takes control of the ring. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him. He knew his deadly peril and the thread upon which his doom now hung. From all his policies and webs of fear and treachery, from all his stratagems and wars, his mind shook free, and throughout his realm a tremor ran. His slaves quailed, and his armies halted, and his captains, suddenly steerless, bereft of will, wavered and despaired. For they were forgotten. The whole mind and purpose of the power that wielded them was now bent with overwhelming force upon the mountain. And when the ring, this vessel for all of Sauron's power, is destroyed by happenstance and destiny, rather than being used, rather than being wielded, Sauron is utterly powerless. He's gone. The Nazgul, the orcs, the armies of darkness were only ever these hollowed-out puppets, animated by Sauron's hatred and his force of will, but with him gone, they dissipate. The reign of Sauron at its heart is nothing. And this is all in service of Tolkien's larger ideas about the dangers of absolute power. It doesn't just corrupt absolutely, it destroys itself. The ring was a mythical way of representing the truth that potency, or perhaps rather potentiality, if it is to be exercised and produce results, has to be externalized, and so as it were passes, to a greater or less degree, out of one's direct control. A man who wishes to exert power must have subjects who are not himself, but then he depends on them. Complete control requires something to control, and in utterly controlling something, you have to hand off some of your power to them. The ring is, quite frankly, idiotic. It shows Sauron's utter ignorance, or at least disregard, for his proper place in the universe. His attempts to become God leave him utterly unraveled, inhuman, and powerless. And the ring stands as a firm statement that the tighter you grasp at power that is not yours, the faster it slips through your fingers. The abilities of the ring, when you get down to it, are quite simple. Long life, invisibility, and just the general enhancement of any of your natural proclivities towards domination. But in its simplicity, it manages to illustrate a much greater truth about human beings and the very human desire to try to become more than who we are meant to be. Of course, I can't exactly recite this entire video every single time that question gets brought up, so if you have a simpler and more concise way that you have of explaining that, I would love to hear it in the comments. And let me know that if you had a ring of power that was like a Hobbit-style ring of power, where it's not actually evil, and that ring could have one ability, what would it be? Mine would probably be instant transportation, because I like traveling, other than the fact that I find it incredibly tedious. So I would get to see a lot more of the world that way, and leave my house more than I do, which would probably be good for me. Give this video a like if you feel like you learned something new, and consider subscribing if you want to come back every single week here for a new video. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy Hobbity day.